Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the IOP's speaker event, Trad Wives and Alpha Males, Gender Relations and the Bender. My name's Katie Frazier, and I'm a fourth year in the college from Dallas, Texas, studying sociology and public policy. At UChicago, I've been involved with the IOP as co-chair of Women and Gender Minorities in Public Service, which focuses on empowering women and gender minorities in public service by building community, developing skills necessary for careers in public service, and providing consistent mentorship and support. Additionally, as someone engaged in conversations around gender, culture, and political polarization, whether through my studies, my involvement with W+, or just daily life, I'm particularly excited for tonight's discussion. Across the United States and beyond, the political and cultural gender divide has become one of the most striking and consequential societal rifts. From debates over masculinity and feminism, to shifting attitudes towards relationship and communication, to the role of gender in our most recent election, the way young people navigate these topics is fundamentally different from past generations. Tonight, we have an incredible panel to help us unpack these shifts and what they mean for the future. Clay Travis is a radio host, founder of OutKick, and a prominent voice in sports and political commentary. His radio program, The Clay Travis and Buck Sexton Show, has reached millions of listeners worldwide. Magdalene Taylor is a writer and cultural critic known for her work on sexuality, gender, and internet culture. Her writing, including her newsletter, Many Such Cases, explores how desire and digital culture inform identity. Daniel A. Cox is the director of the Survey Center on American Life and a senior fellow in polling and public opinion at the American Enterprise Institute. His research focuses on a variety of topics, including the emerging gender divide among young adults, dating and relationships, and social connection. Moderating tonight's conversation is Hanna Rosin, senior editor at The Atlantic and host of Radio Atlantic. She's also the author of the best-selling book, The End of Men. Her work has long explored gender, culture, and power, making her the perfect guide for this discussion. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. First, please make sure to turn off or silence your cell phones. Second, when it's time for the Q&A, a microphone will be placed in the audience, and as usual, we'll give priority for the first questions to students. Finally, please make sure to check out upcoming IOP events, including a conversation with activist David Hogg, which will take place on Monday, February 24th at noon here at Ida Noise, as well as That's What She Said, Stories and Strategies from Political Speechwriters, which will take place on Thursday, February 20th at 5:30 here in Ida Noise. Make sure to check out the IOP's website for more on future speaker series events and other opportunities at the Institute of Politics. Now, please join me in welcoming Clay Travis, Magdalene Taylor, Daniel A. Cox, and Hanna Rosin.
Hi, everyone. Do I have to tell you who's who? Can you guess? You know who's who. That's Magdalene. That's Dan, that's Clay. Welcome, everyone, today. Welcome, students, professors, people from the community. This is a really important discussion, and we've convened people with different views and different expertise on the subject, and we hope we will hear from you at the end of it. I'm going to start with some research that Dan has done. Dan is a pollster, and he has been going around college campuses, including this one, talking to young men about where they're at. And he quoted a young man recently, and the man said, "Among my peer group, there's a saying, and the saying is, we're so back." With the election results, where it's like everybody's very satisfied, everybody's very pleased, we are so back.
I like that kid already.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. So let's start there. That is one really important data point for where America is today at this exact moment, that feeling, that sentiment. I'm reading different people's expressions, and I can already see the reactions. Another, though, is all the other statistics about men in America, that they've been falling behind, dropping out of the workforce, not getting married, not having sex, feeling more lonely, are also still true, and they've been true for a couple of decades. So one thing I want to explore with this panel is, like, on the one hand, we have gloating, we're back. On the other hand, we have some suffering. And so how do those two things fit together? Dan, since you've been going around campuses talking to young men, can you just tell me what you're picking up, like anecdotally, no numbers yet, but what kinds of things are you hearing that are sticking with you?
Yeah, and to be clear, we're talking to young men and young women.
Oh, okay.
Because we're trying to get a sense of where both sides are on a lot of these issues, and increasingly it's becoming clear that they see things very, very differently. A lot of what we talk about in these conversations, whether it's University of Chicago or UVA or schools out in California where we've also been, is just how you feel about how things are going, your views about dating and relationships. And to talk to folks and to look at the polls, I mean, no one feels that great when it comes to dating and relationships. It seems pretty rough out there. I've been married for 10 years, so it's been a little while for me. But the rise of dating apps and the constant use of social media, people use these things sometimes often, but it doesn't seem to make their lives any better. And so what you hear again and again, particularly at a school like University of Chicago, is you have brilliant young people, really dedicated. A lot of them are talking about postponing their romantic interests or experiences. They're not as engaged when it comes to like sort of traditional youthful dalliances. When it comes to like risk taking and that kind of stuff, you just see it's very, very different than Generation X, for instance, how they grew up and all the stuff that they were involved in. And so you have a really significant but not a gender divide, but a generation divide.
Magdalene, I see you shaking your head. You write about sex. You've talked to everyone from incels to, I'm sure, like your friends who are writers who live in Brooklyn. Like, what are the differences you're seeing in how people are talking about this?
Well, I think it's really interesting you brought up that this environment here might have a lot of really intellectually motivated people who are delaying gratification towards a specific end goal. I think that culturally, though, we are seeing a rise of people delaying gratification of having sex, forming relationships, starting families, whatever, toward no specific end. I think that there's a lot of people not having sex and not forming relationships because instead they're, spending a lot of time online. And so I think that's that to me is how I see the shape of the broader sexual gender culture right now, is unfortunately a little bit more bleak to counter the "we're so back." It's perhaps more of a.
I really didn't mean to start with like bleakness and sex. It was not my intention. But okay, we'll bring you in here, Clay. Since you were started on a triumphalist note, and when you're on a podcast, which you have done successfully for so long, it's better to be gloating than to be suffering. It makes for a much better vibe on the podcast. So what do you say about all this? You have people calling into your show.
Yeah.
So you can like read the room of people who listen.
Well, so what I would say in general is I don't disagree with a lot of what she just said. I think we have a profound disconnect between how people are making choices and why they're making those choices that are making them unhappy. I've got 3 boys. And I don't know that any of you listen to your parents at all. My boys, it doesn't matter what I do for a living. I'm just, they're dork of a dad. But they're 17, they're 14, and they're 10. And I'll give you 2 different angles of things that I talk about with them. A few years ago, my 10-year-old at the time, we walked into Target. I think we were going to get baseball or basketball cards. My boys are big card collectors. And there was an entire section right when we walked in of girl power shirts. Mm-hmm. My 10-year-old said, "Dad, they would never make boy power shirts." Mm-hmm. And some of you who might be in your 30s or 40s or 50s might be like, girl power, yay. I think it's important to understand that other people who, like my kids, were born around 2010 are growing up in a different era where they're basically being told not that girls are good, that boys are bad. Mm-hmm. And they're like, what have I ever done that's bad? I'm 10, I don't even get to choose what I eat for dinner. Mm-hmm. How am I responsible for the decline of all of society? So that's something I think it's cognizant to think about when people say, why did young men overwhelmingly swing, according to the Wall Street Journal, 27 points in the direction of Donald Trump between 2020 and 2024. Frankly, I think a lot of young men are over the bullshit in their mind that they're responsible for everything that's ever been wrong in the history of Western civilization. One of my kids' friends said, like when I go to school now, all they tell us is that white men are bad. And they're like, my mom doesn't even let me pick what tennis shoes I wear to school, right? Like, how can I be that bad? I have no agency myself. Second part of this, and this is where they really roll their eyes. Everybody wants to talk about how the environment's collapsing and climate change is going to destroy us all. I actually think it's because we're not having kids, right? Kids, whatever you think of your own particular political life, are actually an incredible endorsement of optimism. There aren't very many times where you have a baby and you think, oh, fuck. You're very excited when you become a dad or a grandpa or a mom or a grandma or an aunt or uncle, brother, sister. Babies represent the future and optimism. And when we're not having them, it's not just the United States, by the way, we're actually doing far better than incredible countries like Italy and Japan and South Korea, which are on a trajectory in the lifetime of some of you, particularly you younger guys and gals out here, where basically the country's not going to exist. Mm-hmm. How does that happen? I think one of the things that's occurring is there is a profound disconnect between men and women. I think you can see it across society. And I think it's why so many people are so profoundly unhappy. And so when I say we're back, I think to a certain extent, part of what this election has represented is, are there men who are jerks and assholes and toxic? Yes. Mm-hmm. But there are women who are jerks and assholes and toxic too. Mm-hmm. Yet we've allowed society to teach a lot of men, hey, toxic masculinity is a thing. I never hear anything about toxic femininity. And by the way, Prince Harry's wife exists. Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot online about toxic femininity.
Not enough.
So, okay. So let me break that down. Two things.
There's a lot of stuff there, but yes.
The first thing you said about toxic, like your boys being sick of men. I have teenage boys too. So your boys being sick of hearing toxic masculinity, everything's my fault. Curious to hear from you two, like, is it time to retire that term? What about the term toxic masculinity? What do we do with it? Has it done us any good?
I mean, I think one of the problems is that a lot of young men don't have great models for behavior. One of the things, in the conversations that I have are young women will be like, the men that are asking us out, they're doing kind of weird stuff. They're not socialized in a way, like you don't talk to someone you're interested in romantically the same way you talk to your bros. Like you want to express interest. You want to sort of be demonstrate that you're willing to go the extra mile, whatever. And so a lot of the conversations that I've heard have been like in that way, that they're not having these kind of conversations with their dads about, hey, this is how you should act. And then the culture is giving them very mixed messages, right? It's sort of saying, well, you need to be really careful about how you act. Holding the door open is not okay. That is, a negative thing now. And so, there's a real confusion, I think, for a lot of young men about, well, what do I do? And so I think the results of that is a bit of stasis, that you have people just sort of saying, well, I'm just going to take a step back. I don't want to get in trouble. I'm just going to focus on myself. That's easier to do, whether it's academics or, financially, or, focus on my physique. I can do all that easily without running into these problems. Mm-hmm.
Magdalene, do you have any views on the term toxic masculinity, like whether it did more harm than good, whether it's like we have to come up with more interesting ways to talk about this?
Yeah, I think that it is unfortunately something that became really flattened, and people began to use toxic masculinity as a catch-all for masculinity writ large. And I think that there's been a conflation there of masculinity itself being toxic, which I do think has had some of the consequences that you're talking about. I do think that increasingly in my circles, I am seeing more of a discussion around toxic femininity possibly being a thing. But I do think overall, kind of as to what you were saying, that the way that we understand how we are supposed to be a man or how we are supposed to be a woman Even if those are ideals we want to strive toward, there's not a coherent message in what any of that even means anymore.
Right. So the picture that you all are painting are like men are somewhat beleaguered. Like they're confused, they don't really know what the message is, they're beleaguered. However, weirdly in this moment, or interestingly, or something I can't quite put together, is how it's translated into power, basically. Like usually if you're victimized, you don't, like right now we're at a moment of male power, like the ascendance of male power again in a way we haven't seen in a while. Can you talk about the gender divide? Like it was a surprising thing how young men were a constituency that Trump tuned into, realized were turning towards him in a way he didn't expect.
Yeah, so I actually first wrote about this like 3 years ago, and looking at some trend data. So Gallup releases data every year, and you can track it back to the late 90s. And basically, throughout that time, there's not a huge difference between where young men and young women are politically. The similar numbers identify as liberal, similar numbers identify as Democratic. And then beginning around 2016, 2017, you have this divergence which just explodes. So young women have become much more liberal. Young men have not become much more conservative, at least according to Gallup, but they have become more Republican. So you have this interesting...
Wait, say that again, the men?
They have not identified as more conservative, but they are becoming more Republican. So from the Obama era, young men and young women were Democrats, right? For both elections, strong majorities of young men and young women voted for Barack Obama. And then you had a slow decline, right? This didn't happen in just one election. There's been a deterioration of Democratic identity among young men for over 10 years. And so
are you saying specifically they turn against Democrats?
I'm saying that they are more, yes, they are more Republican now, but not necessarily because they've shifted to the right on issues like climate change or abortion or same-sex marriage. They're still well to the left of their dads and grandfathers when it comes to that stuff. And so you have this really interesting situation where this group, again, looks on paper fairly liberal in a lot of ways. And in point of fact, you had 6 in 10 young men who are moderates vote for Trump, and more than 1 in 5 liberal young men vote for Trump, right? And so if we're gonna look for explanations, we need to move beyond issues. We need to understand, like, there's something about Trump that was attractive, and then there's something about the Democratic Party, at least in its current manifestation, that was repellent.
Mm-hmm. You were shaking your head again. What resonates?
Yeah, I just think that there's, it's very hard for people to try to understand the motivations, of somebody they see as different to them. And I think that is, part of the phenomenon that I'm witnessing with regard to this gender war we seem to be experiencing, is kind of an unwillingness to think about why might a young man want to vote for Trump, and why might some of those reasons be something beyond loving fascism or something, for example. Mm-hmm.
They don't know what fascism is. Nobody does.
So yeah, I just think there's a lot of confusion right now about what motivates another person, and I think that I was really struck by you saying, especially that even if they are more likely to identify as Republicans, they're still far more liberal than the men of generations before them, and I think that that's something that would surprise a lot of young women like myself to hear that. I was surprised. Mm-hmm.
Clay, I'm sure it's no mystery to you because listening to your podcast, it's like 99.9% of people must be Trump voters. So what is it that we're missing about, or what is it that people who are not, as Magdalene said, people who don't understand why? That's my first question. I have a second one, but go ahead.
Okay, so what I would start with is men aspire to be bigger, stronger, and faster than we are, almost universally. That's why superheroes are popular. That's why pro athletes are popular. Who is the most masculine Democrat right now in America? Mayor Pete.
Is that a gay joke?
No, Mayor Pete. No, it's just that he's not particularly masculine. Nobody's like, oh, Mayor Pete, he's a badass. Chuck Schumer. Is anybody like, hey, Chuck Schumer holding up an avocado and a beer to talk about the Super Bowl? Is anybody like that trying to grill? Is anybody like, hey, that's a dude I want to hang out with?
But Trump's like a grandpa.
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
Trump took a bullet in his ear and immediately stood up and said, fight, fight, fight. Every man in America and most of the women out here were impressed by that, even if the women won't admit it. She's shaking her head strong. And second part of this, basically summing it up, Democrats for men are pussies and Republicans
Democrats for men
are pussies. There are no masculine men in the Democrat Party right now. And for a lot of young, people are going to be upset, for a lot of young men, if you want to talk about what they're looking for, there is a wide range of masculinity that's popular on the internet right now, right? Think about it. Jordan Peterson, who is super philosophical.
grandpa.
Somewhat, yes, but also super philosophical and frankly, I think almost impossible to understand at times, is wildly popular, right? I would put him on one extreme of someone who speaks to young men. On the other extreme is Andrew Tate, right? There is a huge dichotomy between what Jordan Peterson would be saying and what Andrew Tate would be saying. And there's all sorts of people in the middle. I would put myself in the middle somewhere there, right? But what they all represent is young men searching for masculinity and what it means. And unfortunately, a lot of young men don't have father figures in the household. So you said, Donald Trump may be a grandfather. A lot of people refer to him as Daddy Trump. They're looking for a strong masculine figure in their life. They may have a single parent household. It wasn't just white kids who showed up and overwhelmingly started voting for Trump. Black, Hispanic, Asian kids. I think what it represents is masculinity is under siege. We've seen religion decline. If you really want me to drive this room crazy, here you go. Every woman in here right now, they probably won't say it publicly, but one day they would like to be married to a man who makes more money than them and will give them an opportunity to raise kids without having to have a job on their own. Every single one of you, I think that's true.
That sounds
you might
really
not say
fucking
it publicly.
boring, and I'm speaking as a person with 3
I'm
kids.
telling you, it's true.
If you have sat home with your children all day, you're like, wow, look, give me some more
I'm
of
not
that.
saying I want to
Anyway.
stay home with kids all day. I'm saying you want the opportunity to do it. That's true. And if you're not thinking it yet, you will be at some point. And that's because biology is real, which Democrats also don't believe.
Okay, let's not rise. You're doing too many provocations.
Too much all at once.
It's too much all at once. Let's slow down the provocations.
I get it. You guys don't get this often.
That's 7. We can only handle 1 at a time. We're delicate liberals. I'm just kidding, but I'm just the moderator. So I want to go back to the Trump and the gender divide. We talked about it from the male point of view.
Yeah.
So from the female point of view, what I understand a lot of the research shows is that a lot of the divide is around like vice, aberrant behavior, that kind of thing. It's like almost men don't tune into that part of it, and women notice that really, really hard, by which I mean like sexual abuse charges, the way they talk. Does that show up in the data?
I mean, I think if you want to understand Trump's appeal, right, there's the masculinity thing. But I think also it's the fact that he, despite having already been president, is still viewed as an outsider. Like, he's not viewed as part of the political establishment. And your generation, at least for the students in here, is the first generation that has never had faith in the political system and our political leaders. So we asked a really interesting question last year, and it was, to what extent, when you were growing up, did you feel like political leaders could generally be trusted? The political system was generally working well. So for baby boomers, for Gen X, and even for millennials, they said, yeah, when I was growing up, we could generally trust the political leadership in this country. But for Gen Z, they never said that. So they've always grown up in a country where there's been some amount of suspicion of the political leadership. And then, comes along Trump in 2016 and says, yeah, you're right to be suspicious because they're all freaking crooks. I
meant more like, why do women respond negatively to Trump? Like, there's men responding positively, but there's also women responding negatively to Trump.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
I can speak to some of the stuff that we've heard, and some of it's pretty self-evident, right? Like the sexual abuse allegations, the infidelity, like his, denigration of women in public. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for people to say this guy is not a role model. And in point of fact, young men may like his sense of masculinity and sort of unapologetic persona. But most of the men I talk to just say like, yeah, I recognize that he's not a good role model in a lot of ways. He doesn't necessarily have a great relationship with his kids. I'm a dad. I have 2 boys too. And I think there's a way in which that.
Sorry to cut you off. I think he actually has a great relationship with his kids. I mean, in all seriousness, I'm not saying he's a perfect husband. He certainly isn't. But all 5 of his kids, based on my experience, and his grandkids, all really love him. And he seems to have. And I've interviewed him 10 times.
You can understand why what it is that women are like.
Oh, I certainly understand why some women
Yeah.
don't like Trump. I mean, that's not a huge surprise. I mean, a lot of women see him as like the worst guy that they dated.
Yeah.
Right in their life, and
or an abusive boss, or like these are the words that of the folks that we've talked to. They see in him like some of the worst characteristics of people in authority.
Right.
And so like that comes out, and I think that's not again a shocking revelation.
So I see, like, if you have a generation that is kind of anti-authority, anti-institution, women will respond to that as like he's the worst kind of authority, and men will respond to him like he's outside the authorities.
He's draining the swamp.
Yeah, he's like draining the swamp. He's something else. Magdalene, a question for you. Here's a position I think women are in sometimes, and I'm asking you to be an anthropologist, not talk about your own personal views. You have this response to Trump. You're like, he's sexual abuse charges, whatever, infidelity, things that you don't like. But then you're kind of in a position of being like a scold or like a prude or something like that. Like, as a person who happily, openly writes about sex, like where do you find the line there? Like, how do you criticize something like that without putting yourself in a position of like, schoolmarm?
Well, I think that's kind of something that really represents the turn, of this election is this reaction to the idea of being scorned. I think that is a lot of men who have been pushed, further to the right, who now voted for Trump and maybe didn't previously. I think that the sentiment that I see there is that they are sick of being scorned or called out or criticized by domineering women. And it's not exactly a line that I feel like I have to draw in my own work, but I do think that itself is what characterizes this current moment.
I would also just point out, I think many people out there believe that Trump is imperfect in many ways, which he is, but also that he's been held to a standard for both men and women that's different than Biden. For instance, Biden was very credibly accused of sexually assaulting one of his former assistants when he was a senator. It got almost no attention. Bill Clinton was very credibly accused of rape and all sorts of crazy sexual improprieties, including, for those of you who are too young to remember it, banging an intern with a cigarette at the Resolute desk, literally in the White House. That happened. So I think a lot of people out there have moved beyond the, hey, I'm going to use the president of the United States in any way as some sort of moral arbiter. And so I think for young people, they feel like they've been lied to. One of the guys that brought me here today said COVID shut down his school in March of 2020, and most of the kids in his school, he's a junior, didn't ever return to school. We failed an entire generation of young people. And I think when you have lived through that, you have a lot less credit and faith in the government, just like historically, and I'm a history nerd, it took a very long time if you went through the Vietnam War, which maybe I can't see everybody's face. Maybe there's some of you out there that actually had to go through the draft where you sat and watched to see whether or not you're going to be sent to carry a gun and walk around in a jungle and get shot at. When you live through that, you might be pretty skeptical in the 60s and 70s of the government. I think COVID for this generation of young men in particular who got locked up, who weren't allowed to play sports, all of this, they're angry. And when they see Trump, he seems like an avatar for their anger in a way that doesn't necessarily translate. And by the way, I think there's a lot of young women who feel that same anger. And that's why I think, in the CBS poll that came out Monday, Trump's best numbers were voters under 30. He was plus 10. He was better with voters under 30 than he was voters over 65. I just don't think that people have really played in. I mean, you're a lot younger than I am, but I don't think that people really understand, for people who are teenagers or in their 20s, how psychically devastating COVID was. If you're my age, you lived at home and did all your work, and you're married for 20 years and you got kids. Like, my 10-year-old said, like, COVID was the best year ever because Dad and Mom were home, all day long, every day, and he didn't have to go to school. We used to get a snow day every now and then. One day in March, they woke up and they didn't have to go back to school for the whole 3 months. So for him, 2020, he was like, everybody keeps saying 2020 was an awful year. It was the best year ever, Dad. So the perspective is different. He was 10.
Yeah.
But I think if you were 14 and you didn't get to go to prom, or you didn't get to play your senior year football season, those kids are angry, and I understand it. And I think Trump taps into that anger, even though he was far from perfect himself on COVID.
So publicly, we've talked about the gender divide. Men are responding in a certain way. Dan, is it your impression? My impression from your research is that we have now landed in a situation where men and women are seeing totally different realities. Like, they're not even looking at the same picture a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, when you listen to them talk about Trump, for instance, it sounds like they're talking about two different people. So like the frames of reference are really different. I think when it comes to some of the big decisions and personal aspirations, there is still some commonality and common interests. So like, for instance, most young people still want to get married. There is a divergence when it comes to wanting to be parents. So for the first time, we're seeing in polling now that young men are much more likely to want to become dads than young women are to want to become moms. And I don't know if anyone's dug deep into like what's going on there. From a lot of the conversations that I have and some of the data that we see, there's, I think, concern about what that will mean for their professional lives, careers. I think there's still an enduring discomfort with the disparity in household labor, which is still alive and well, even with millennial dads stepping up. So I think there's some of that going on as well. But I think when it comes to politics, what you see is not necessarily that going in starkly different directions, but I see a generation of young men still looking around, trying to figure things out. And so when it comes to things like climate change or gun control, young women care about these things an awful lot, particularly college-educated young women. But young men, these are not the issues that animate them. And so when it comes to the Democratic Party talking about things like reproductive health rights and stuff like that does not land. And I've written about this previously, that I think
it doesn't land with men.
With men. And I mean,
meaning they just don't hear it, or they're not interested?
Increasingly, by the way, if we want to dive into this, I think it's not going to land with young women either.
Well, look, you guys are saying very different things. Like, you are saying women want this, women want this. You're not finding that in the numbers. Like, what's the disparity? Like, you are not finding that women are, what they're looking for is to be able to stay home and raise kids.
I think
that doesn't seem to be their desire in the numbers. So is this a difference between like college-educated women? Like, where's the gap?
Well, when it comes to marriage, yes. I mean, I think Cleave and I would agree that is still an aspiration for a wide.
I'm not saying everybody wants it. I'm saying they want the choice. I believe almost every single woman married to a man would like for her husband to make more money than her and give her the option to either stay home and not have to work or hire help so that she can work and she doesn't have to take kids to daycare, right? I think that a huge part of fighting that goes on, and we know finances are a huge part of why every couple fights, newsflash for those of you who are younger, and having more money diminishes the number of fights that you're going to have about things, because usually when you're fighting over money, it's how do you allocate limited resources in a way that will try to make everybody happier. And
I'm going to provide a little more of a nuanced take on this than Clay.
I'm just telling you what the truth is. He can dive into the nuance.
I do think there's a way in which like the lean-in girl boss thing is not as attractive, for a lot of the young women that we talk to, than there perhaps once was, right? That Yeah. Now, when you ask, some surveys will show that when you ask, would you prefer like a part-time job with flexible hours, and to be, able to pick up your kids at 3 o'clock, there's a lot of support, even from younger liberal women.
What about
for
men?
that kind, and for men too, but less so. But yeah, like the what all parents want more than anything else, and I will say this as a parent of a first and third grader, like flexibility is absolutely key. And I am lucky enough to have a job that I have that kind of flexibility. And for a lot of parents, they don't want to send their kids to daycare all day. They probably want some time away from their kids, but then also to be able to be there for them as well. And again, that's crossing, I think, ideological and class lines.
And is there, sorry to do this, but is there any data to support the fact that there are a large number of women who want to be home taking care of their kids? Like, has that number changed over the years? Has it gone down or gone up?
I don't know, actually. That's a really good question. I have not seen any data that suggests that it's fundamentally shifted in the last decade or so, which is when I've started looking at this stuff.
Because okay, let's talk. So all of this in politics, it's like 4 years you elect one person, 4 years you elect another person. It looks different. It seems like where the rubber meets the road is in these dating relationships. Like if nobody's having sex and people are not dating and that kind of thing is not working.
Nobody's having kids.
That seems,
that data is true.
That's like an issue. So if women are the ones resisting marriage, what is everybody's guess about why that's happened? That does show up in the data. I'm right about that, right? We're moving towards the, say, Korean model where people are getting married later and later and resisting sort of ending up in that.
Later and later, and I think there's a way in which single women now they're more concerned about ending up with the wrong person than with no one at all. We've seen that in our data. I think
why? What's the wrong person mean? What position?
So I think it goes back to if you do want a career, are you going to end up having to pull both you're going
to have to make more than the man,
work and then all the domestic labor as well.
So you want a man who makes more money than you,
or just a man who works.
And then the other thing, I think that the institution of marriage actually is come under greater suspicion among college-educated women. So again, we have data that suggests for single college-educated women, they think single women are happier than married women.
All right, let's just give Magdalene a chance here because we are talking about women. So Magdalene, before.
Yeah,
you're out there talking to men and women, so.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like really whatever we want to talk about of, women's expectations and desires for the future, we're really talking about, an economic fantasy. Like the idea that, do women want the option of having a partner who makes more money than them so that they can stay home? Obviously, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, having that desire, and I think that a lot of people do have that desire. But I think that what's the foundation of the fact that a lot of women do not have that desire is that it is simply an economic infeasibility. It's not a reality for most women that they will have a partner who makes so much more than them that they can afford to stay home, with very few exceptions. And
so you're saying a family where only one person works is just not that feasible in the U.S. these days.
Yeah, or it's simply, it's certainly not the stay-at-home mom fantasy that we've seen in television. I think a lot of households where women are not working, it is because daycare is so unaffordable that it doesn't make sense for them to try to go out and earn an income to put the child in daycare. But also, the trad wife image, I think that the women who do aspire towards that, which I think is also a very specific niche of women, I think there's a lot more women who do enjoy the idea of being a parent and, being able to spend time with their child, but do not actually have this trad wife fantasy image. But the trad wife fantasy image is a very wealthy one. It's one of the leisure class where you have so much, time and money that you can make parenting and homesteading, practically your hobby.
I think we also understand that the trad wives, in the ones that we all know the names of, are making all the money because they're the Instagram stars and the men are their agents. So that's a really confusing situation.
This is something I'll say that the women are all going to agree with me on. It's going to shock you. Men are not living up to the expectations that you have for men, which is why a lot of women are single. They can't find men of the same achievement level as them.
Yeah.
And they don't want to worry that in addition to having to raise kids, they're going to have to drag a man around and be the breadwinner and the mom.
Right. So what do
And
you?
so-
So that's the key. That's that.
Right.
Well, I mean, there's a class. We're not talking about class here. So let's put that aside.
But I think
yeah.
this is important too. 60% of college graduates now are women.
Right.
Right? So it is impossible, sorry girls, for every woman,
There are no girls here. Just
girls, boys,
Yes.
You're girls and boys to
Yes.
me too, as
Okay.
well as men and women. You know, I know it's policing language is a big part of what the Atlantic does, not what we do at OutKick.
the Atlantic is barely liberal. So
Yes.
yes.
Also has never made a profit without a multi-billionaire running it, which is worth knowing too. But unlike my company, which is wildly profitable because we speak to a big audience of people. But I do think if you look at 60% of women graduating from college, 40% are men, the math doesn't add up, right? And
Right,
then if
but
you go to grad school.
this is the problem to solve. Like, I think my big worry is that what I started saying was these statistics haven't changed. They've been true for 20 years. Like the disparities in college, they've been true for a long time, and they're getting worse. So the kind of like what's happened now, which is backlash, rage, whatever you want to call it. I'm just wondering if it makes things better or worse.
Let me ask this question: women, a plumber can make $100,000 a year. How many University of Chicago grad women would marry a plumber? I'm just curious. Okay, so 5.
I think people respect skills these days.
There's new research that shows this is exactly what's happening. That
I'm not taking a shot at it. I'm just curious.
College-educated women are actually marrying financially viable men without degrees.
Uh-huh.
And the real losers are the women without college degrees, and those are the women who want to find a partner or want to get married and are unable to do so.
We're also really speaking in abstracts here. I think a lot of women, yes, would marry a plumber who makes $100,000 a year if he's really nice to her.
How often in Brooklyn are you in a bar where a plumber would go?
Plenty often.
My point is that where you're looking, I think is oftentimes not the same. Like when I go out of Manhattan, there are a lot of men who make a lot of money, right? But there are way more girls that are running around in Manhattan trying to find those guys. In other words, what was the thing that was super viral on TikTok? I want a guy who's 6'2", works at an investment bank and makes 6 figures or whatever. Every girl sharing that thing on TikTok like crazy. That's like 0.5%, right?
I fundamentally agree that social media especially has created warped expectations.
Yeah.
I
think that's a big part of this too.
For what as a woman you're supposed to aspire towards. I think that it's a social competitiveness thing where you want your boyfriend that you post on TikTok to check these marks, not necessarily for your own desires, but because of a display that you're making on social media. However, I don't think that necessarily speaks to the true average young woman.
Mm-hmm.
The true average young woman, this is true, so you mentioned social media, and I do think it factors in a big way. 30% of teenage girls have thought about killing themselves in the last year. Mm-hmm. 30%. I mean, that is a society that is profoundly sick, and those numbers, if you look at it, have skyrocketed since social media came into ascendance. So I don't think that those are not, to me, there's a direct correlation between social media and what it's done to young people in terms of, I think, just making them less happy. I mean, I don't know how many people here, I mean, like I said, I've got 3 boys, like nobody goes on dates anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, I can't see everybody's face out here, so I can't see how young you are, but how many people have been on an actual date? Just college kids only. Just raise your hands, I'm curious. Okay, well that's actually, I can't tell the percentage, but that's actually somewhat decent. Mm-hmm. But it seems like that is actually quite rare. And I'm not talking about a group date where 20 people go to a bar. I'm talking about you and one other person.
So women have higher levels of anxiety, right? I mean, that shows up in the numbers. Yeah. Since 2012, late teen girls up to women, lots more anxiety, men, maybe a lot more anger. So the big question to me, like in some ways, there's like a lot of Venn diagram overlap when we do diagnosis. The issue comes in is when we try and like turn the ship. And how do you turn the ship? I think that's where the disagreements between men and women come in. Is that more or less correct? Like if you were to take men and women and ask them, what's your ideal vision for what the relationship between men and women would look like, would it be different? Would women name one vision and men name another vision?
That's probably always been true, though, right?
And that's quite an extrapolation to make.
Well, it's I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. Like, why aren't? Is it just like cell phones? Why aren't people having sex? Why aren't people getting
it's cell
married?
phones. It's social media. It's like a culture of individualism, right? We talked a little bit about this in the green room, and some of it's on parents and how they're parenting. You're not getting into the school, for the most part, unless you're incredibly exceptional. If your parents aren't pretty involved in your life and taking you to travel sports or encourage your interest in music or art. And so when we ask questions about what's important to you, we don't hear a lot in our surveys, volunteering at my church. And I'm not saying that y'all don't do volunteer activities, but that's not what is at the top of the list. It's personal achievement. It's sort of professional advancement. Those are the things that this generation tells us they really value, as opposed to more sort of communitarian practices and activities.
I mean, one thing you notice about men online is that they're often alone. Like there's a category of video, like morning routine video
mode.
For men. They're like looks maxing, scent maxing, but a lot of times they're like on their own,
I mean, that's really, I think you can build, what I will say in general is, the younger generation is profoundly risk averse.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that can be good. Right? Like, I think most people out there, certainly I'm a parent, I think it's better if kids aren't drinking a lot at 16 and doing a lot of drugs and frankly, having a lot of sex. Like, I think it's actually healthier to wait. The challenge is that when you are risk averse in everything, you give up on a lot of life. I think part of it is so much of life now is in the phone. We won't give our kids a phone till they're 14, right? And everybody's got different ages, but I think the longer you can keep a phone from kids, the better. When I was growing up, you had to go somewhere to be around other people. Now my kids are all, snapping photos every day so they can keep their snap streak going, and they feel like that's a relationship. But sometimes it's a picture of a wall. And I'm like, that doesn't feel like, or it's just a selfie or something. It doesn't feel like a deep connection. And I will say, I remember, I've got a younger sister, and it was a big deal, the phone, right? Who's on the phone, who's calling. You had to call and you had to say, can I talk to so-and-so, Mr. You knew the parents in a way. I feel like so much of the phone is now taking dominance that they don't feel the need to experience the world because they think they're experiencing the world through their phones. And so that is a real challenge. And honestly, I hope that we're going to see a sort of a reversion in society. Maybe some of you guys are younger than me and you're already doing it. Go out and don't allow anybody to take a phone with them. Like, have any of you even experienced what it's like to go out with 10 people and there's not going to be a single photo and you can do something crazy and it's not going to be on video and your life isn't ruined? Like for most of us who grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, like that was the era. Let me give you, I'm a sports guy. I saw a video that didn't come out for a long time. I don't know how many of you watched The Last Dance, the Michael Jordan era Bulls doc. Dennis Rodman came out from one of the title games, pounded a beer in front of the cops, high-fived all of them, and then got on a motorcycle without a helmet and drove off. That was on video. If that happened today, like he would go to prison for years. Like they would run him out of the world, right? But at that point in time, I'm not encouraging, pounding beers and hopping on motorcycles without helmets. I'm just saying in the 90s and in the early 2000s, I was talking with a former member of the Chicago Bears, 85. And he was like, you wouldn't believe the stuff we got into because you didn't worry that there was always somebody with a camera like taking a shot of you. We had lives that were outside of our phones, and it feels to me like a lot of people now use their phones to try to pretend the lives are better than they actually are, instead of just living an awesome life. So that's my old man rant.
That is what parents always say that, and I'm always wondering if that's, I think it's true. I'm just, because it's a thing that parents always say. Like, Magdalene, when you ask people why they're not having sex, can they articulate it? Or you just don't know? People who aren't having sex just don't know why it's not happening. Like, they can't articulate it.
Well, they're not putting themselves in environments where that would happen. A lot of the people who I speak to are specifically very online people who do not believe that they would be able to, meet somebody at a bar, for example, and take them home, or they have tried dating apps and they don't have any success. Some, have consumed so much pornography that they are no longer actually interested in pursuing, real life sexual encounters. But it's a real combination of factors here. But it does ultimately all boil down to phone usage, to dating apps, to the way that technology has, invaded every corner of our intimate lives, and that it's both the cause of the problem itself and the proliferation of it. With the phones, they don't feel motivated to pursue sex.
I would say like the most unsurprising correlation I've ever seen in data is the relationship between like socializing, going to parties, having lots of friends, and dating. Those things are just highly, highly correlated. And Gen Z does less of all of it than previous generations.
It's time to move to audience Q&A. So, we're already lined up. Holy moly! I can't see. I was going to bring up the subject of trans rights, but great, I don't have to. So go ahead. You go. We'll start right, go left, go right, go left. So with the red shirt.
Awesome. My name's Elizabeth. I'm a fourth year in the college, and my question is about whether the data or just like any of your anecdotal observations suggest that there's kind of like a top-down effect with how potentially young men are listening to people like President Trump describe women or describe reproductive health policies related to women's bodies, and how that might be influencing this gender divide or kind of informing the way that young men talk to young women that could explain some of this data. And I was also curious about whether you think, like as a side note, reproductive healthcare policies or feeling like access to reproductive healthcare is under threat has also had an effect on young people's sexual habits.
Who's answering? Who's taking that one?
There's a lot to unpack there. I do think that, and Clay, you may have thoughts on this. I do think that the sort of the podcast stuff, the manosphere, and the sort of related content, which, to be clear, is a lot about stuff other than politics. And I think that's something that the left gets profoundly wrong about it, that young men tune into this stuff, not necessarily to receive political messages, but they like the host and they think they're funny, and they feel like they talk freely and talk to them about issues that they care about. And yeah, there are political messages in there. And so I think certainly that is framing for them some of the issues and highlighting particular issues that they should and do care about. But I don't think it's simply that. One of the things that it has become clear in some of the conversations I've had is that so much of this stuff, and I think so much of the awkward and the sort of friction between young men and young women comes from like a lack of just experience. That when people don't have a ton of experience socializing and dating, it's just a lot harder to do it well. And then particularly when stuff moves online and you have a real sort of disconnect in communication problems. So I think that's what I'd say to that.
My theory on this, and you can clip it and call me an idiot in 10 years if I'm wrong, which trust me, a lot of people do on everything, is that because abortion is now a state, I think it's a really smart question, first of all. I think now that abortion is a state issue, that it's going to become much less of a national issue. And one data point that I've heard very few people talk about, but I do think had an impact in 2024, there were more abortions in 2023 than before Roe v. Wade was overturned. So I think it had a resonance in 2022 because I think The Handmaid's Tale, they're going to drag pregnant women out of the house. Donald Trump's going to force you to have a baby. I think that worked in 2022. I think for most people, now they look around, I think they're recognizing that abortion is going to be more legal, more lenient in terms of the law in like California, New York, and Illinois. And then there are going to be states like where I live in Tennessee, where it's going to be more restrictive. And so if you care desperately about that, it will be interesting to see over time, do more young people move to states that are more open in their abortion policies? I'm skeptical, but that opportunity would be there. I'll tell you, Nashville, Tennessee is booming. And every day, I mean, some of you are going to move there as soon as you graduate and you're going to love it. Every day it feels like there's more people there. I just don't think that fear is there. And I think it's going to diminish as a federal issue in the years ahead. Again, maybe I'm wrong. You can clip me and call me an idiot in a decade.
All right, go ahead. Yes, we're going to try and get through a lot of questions, so go. I'm only going to let one person answer each question. Go ahead.
My name's Christine. I already graduated college, is here for the event today. My question is, I guess going back to the theme of tonight, when we look at alpha male and trad wife, it's all about desirability. That's what we're talking about tonight. What do you guys, it's an open question, what are your thoughts on the fact that when we talk about alpha male, it's desirability, attractiveness as defined by men, but talking about trad wife, it's still defined by men. I'm asking this question because I came in a little late. I don't know your name, sir, to the right. Yeah, you raised a very good point about how, right, name a single attractive Democrat.
Well, I think I said a super masculine Democrat.
Sure.
I mean, Mayor Pete's a great looking man.
But that's a very valid point,
John
right?
Fetterman less so, no offense to John Fetterman, but.
That's a very valid point in that right now, as of now, the brand, the publicity of attractiveness is so overclaimed or so underclaimed by Democrats, Republicans. And then as women, the only kind of brand of attractiveness that's viral out there is trad wife. How do we reconstruct a brand of attractiveness for women? What could that look like? Why is that?
I'll let you answer the woman
Magdalene,
question.
you've written about
Yeah, I mean,
dressing
I
for
think
men.
that these are very online archetypes that we're working with here. The trad wife to me is a very niche one that I don't think actually has a lot of mainstream play in what women want for themselves and how they want to sexually present themselves. The alpha male, however, is, I think people would understand what you meant when you said alpha male, pre-internet. However, I don't think women really want a man who identifies as an alpha male. Perhaps they do subconsciously or consciously want the traits that would make somebody an alpha male, but to call yourself one is not very attractive.
Let me also say, I think you raised a good point. Tim Walz, Democrats know they have a man problem, but they're so bad at even understanding what men want that they thought Tim Walz was the answer. Tim Walz is like the guy that men recognize is not actually a dude they'd want to hang out with. But they were like, we're going to put him in a camo hat, and we're going to talk about the fact that he coached high school football. And then he walked out and did spirit fingers and his awkward leg kick, and every dude was like, this is not really the kind of guy that I can connect with, right? Before he let the whole city of Los Angeles burn down, I thought Gavin Newsom was probably the best masculine avatar that the Democrat Party had. I'm not sure that he's going to be the nominee, but you kind of look around. I think that stuff matters in terms of how you connect. Look, the CBS poll, Trump has a 60% approval rating with men right now. 60. I don't remember the last time somebody got to 60. Okay? 40% of men don't like Trump, but 60-40 is pretty crazy. And I think it's because Democrats have a monster male problem.
Okay, to the right.
So my name is Eduardo. I'm a first year in the college, and my question is regarding the media. And I was wondering how the media affects this conversation, more specifically entertainment and Hollywood as a whole, not specifically journalism, so focusing on the entertainment side. So from the 70s to the 90s to early 2000s, the age of movies that you guys in the panel grew up watching, we had a bunch of action movies and really masculine superstars. So Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Sylvester Stallone, and stuff like that. And now, first of all, Hollywood doesn't have that much influence as it has before. And second of all, we don't have that many superstars doing movies. And what do you think that has an effect on people regarding having role models as seen in the movies?
Who was it who mentioned role models here as men? Was it you? Okay, go ahead.
I think we both
You can-
might have.
Yeah,
Oh,
you can
man.
answer. I mean, the question is like the decline of the cinematic, obvious, knowable.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk at like a 10,000 foot level. I mean, I think that the media environment in general, whether it's entertainment or news, is so fractured that we're going to entirely different places. And I think one of the things that, another thing that Democrats misunderstood in 2024 is just how to reach young men and where were they? And they weren't, following mainstream news sources. They were listening to podcasts. They were doing sort of more discreet stuff. And I think like that to me is the lesson that you can no longer, opt into like one channel, but you've got to, meet people where they are, and they're in a lot of different places.
I would just say the number of superstars, I think, has declined precipitously in movies in general.
Yeah.
And now that alpha male desire is still there, but they put them in tights and turn them into superheroes. And there's like 3 different Chris's that are in the Marvel movies right now, and I can't tell them apart, right? Whereas everybody knew Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone and maybe Bruce Willis back in the day. So I think it's actually a decline of the Hollywood star system, which you probably didn't expect me to have a strong take on, but I do.
But also there's actually forget it, irony. Irony. People don't earnestly connect that way. There's like an ironic feeling about a superstar. Anyway, go ahead. Yes.
Hi, my name is Christopher. I'm a 4th year in the college. Thank you all for an awesome discussion. I've really enjoyed it. I appreciate when you spoke on risk aversion among young people, and I think it's both genders, but I think particularly young men have a sense of risk aversion, and you spoke to it. I'm wondering if you'll speak to the Me Too movement and that sort of cultural shift several years back when, for instance, I was in middle school and high school, when that occurred. What impact do you think that had, perpetuated in large part by the media, onto culture, especially regarding young men, and how does that impact relations between young men and young women?
You want to take this one, Magdalene? Because I think that's an important question. There are kids who grew up just like young, but hearing about the Me Too movement, making themselves think that they were dangerous in some way.
Yeah, I think that, for whatever achievements, of the Me Too movement, whatever those achievements were in removing predators from Hollywood, there has been a rippling social effect that it has instilled in the minds of young people that you could be a predator at any time, you could be perceived as a predator at any time. And that there's going to be a culture of surveillance watching you specifically for those behaviors. I do think that it has led young men to be afraid of approaching women at bars, to be perceived as creepy, to have any kind of romantic or sexual interest in somebody publicly, because you've seen how public your downfall could be for these things, whether that's an accurate reflection of what's going to happen or not. I think that specifically young men do need to get over that fear of being seen as creepy. Don't be creepy, but you're allowed to approach a woman at a bar, and a woman's not going to take out her phone and call you a predator and get you banned from the university.
I do think it goes to the fear, because a lot of these places don't even allow, for a while, if you were accused of impropriety on campuses, you weren't allowed to confront your accuser. That was the rule, right? And I think there's a big difference between Harvey Weinstein and between, say, what Brett Kavanaugh was accused of. If getting drunk at a high school party and trying to make out with a girl 30 years later doesn't allow you to be a Supreme Court justice.
Let's leave that one.
He didn't do it.
That's not what he was accused of, and we don't know what happened because it was never adjudicated. So
he certainly is 100% innocent. We do know the facts there.
We actually don't. It wasn't adjudicated.
Yeah, it was.
I'm
certainly.
not saying he was or wasn't.
Let me dive in on that question.
Why don't we let them answer their
question? For me too, at least if you want to look at some of the data, the data at least suggests that it had much more of a formative experience for young women than young men.
Say it again. It was
much more of a formative experience for young women than young men. Some of the young men I would interview would say something like, I thought that was just a celebrity thing, or it doesn't impact me, I don't do that stuff.
Interesting.
So there may have been some impact in just like how they think about approaching women, and I think particularly being blown up on social media is a concern. But just in terms of the fear, anxiety we hear from women about the issue of sexual assault and sexual harassment, trend data shows that concerns about sexual assault among younger women increased dramatically after 2017, something like a 20-point increase. So again, like it had a pretty significant impact.
That's really interesting. Okay, go ahead. You.
All right, hi, thank you guys for coming here. My name's Sam, I'm a second year at the college. I just wanted to read a quote from C.S. Lewis really quickly and then ask Clay a question. So this is from it's from an essay called The Necessity of Chivalry. All right. The knight is a man of blood and iron, a man familiar with the sight of smashed faces and the ragged stumps of lopped-off limbs. He is also a demure, almost maiden-like, guest in the hall, a gentle, modest, unobtrusive man. He is not compromised or happy mean between ferocity and meekness. He is fierce to the nth and meek to the nth. The man who combines both characters, the knight, is not a work of nature but of art, of that art which has human beings instead of canvas or marble for its medium. Clay, I'm just curious whether you think that there is space in your vision of masculinity for that kind of man.
Can you think of an example of someone that would embody that? I'm asking you. I mean, I think it's an interesting question. I'm not familiar with that quote. It's a great quote. Can you think of someone that you believe would embody it today?
Like in my own life or like in...
Well, I mean, someone publicly.
Yeah. Someone in politics?
I mean, anything, any part of culture. So the reason why I'm asking is I'm trying to work through and think about who would embody those characteristics presently, right? Someone who is, basically able to win a gladiatorial fight, but then also is going to, show up in the halls of power and be incredibly humble and meek. And
LeBron.
Yeah, LeBron James. I don't think there's many of them at this point, but I also think
LeBron is an awful choice, but I appreciate the suggestion.
Well, you mentioned Mayor Pete earlier, and he was he served in Afghanistan, like he did tours and things like that, and I mean these days,
Mayor
and it's
Pete,
important. Like he doesn't look like a gladiator, but we have weapons where you don't have to
To
fight
be
with
fair,
swords.
Mayor Pete had a surrogate for their baby, and then he and his partner climbed into the bed where the baby was delivered with the baby, which is super weird. And so,
Why is that weird?
why is it? Hold on. How many women here have delivered babies?
No, I mean, but that's complicated.
No,
Surrogacy.
okay. But if you just had somebody else deliver a baby in the baby delivery bed,
I think I'm moderating now, and that might be a little bit
All right,
separate.
wait. Let's get off the weird
your
baby
partner
bed
get
thing.
into it.
Let's get
That's
off.
weird. So I don't think Mayor Pete is the answer.
But that was an interesting
LeBron
conversation.
it's a great question. Well, I don't have a great answer. But Mayor Pete is not it, and neither is LeBron.
So we have time for 3 more. So it's you, and you in the blue shirt, and then everybody after that. We don't have time.
Maybe
so go
Matt
ahead, you.
Damon?
Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Sean. I'm a 4th year in the college, and I also had a question about masculinity. So sure, women are, men are falling behind in terms of education and career, but men commit violence against women. I don't think I'm wrong in saying at a much higher rate than women commit violence against men. And the whole conversation about rape culture and toxic masculinity came out of trying to understand that discrepancy. And you, Clay, even described men want to be strong and fast. And that, to me, speaks of lack of vulnerability and domination.
I think
So I was just going to ask, do you think, how would you explain that discrepancy? Do you think violence is inherent to masculinity? And if so, is that a good thing? Should we promote that kind of an empowerment?
How many people watched the Super Bowl? Do you know why you did to a large extent? Because of violence. Violence is, yes, you did. If they played flag football, 126 million people wouldn't have watched.
Wait,
Violence
people watch
is
soccer.
There's a lot of violence in soccer, believe it or not, too. But to answer your question, on the premise of what you asked, men commit acts of violence against other men at rates off the charts, right? 95% of all violent crime in general is committed by men, almost all of it by men. I do think it's biological. I think it's testosterone. Because if you look, almost all acts of violence are committed between men roughly the age of 16 to 40. And I think, as with many things in biology, there are both positives and negatives with all sorts of traits, right? Men aspire, in general, to be bigger, stronger, and faster than they are. That's why if you look at what men watch, at what men read, by and large, it's consuming products, whether it's pop culture, whether it's sports, whether it's superhero movies, about the stories of men who are bigger, stronger, and faster than they are. Are there downsides to what is high levels of testosterone? Yes, violence is one of them. War is one of them. So to answer your question, I think it's innate to human nature.
Go ahead, you. Yes. Sorry to say you. We just really can't see up here. We're pointing in a rude way, but sorry.
So my name's Alice. I'm a second year in the college, and I guess so. There's this reading of the sort of modern like gender war is that the men who are most often like on the right are sort of these anti-establishment figures. Like Andrew Tate's whole bit is that he wants to like escape the matrix, and then like Theo Von and Joe Rogan or whoever, they promote these very like conspiratorial like anti-establishment mindsets. And then there's also this like coding of like, oh, the feminized like HR class or whatever. My question is, especially like post-election, there's a lot of discourse on why doesn't the anti-establishment left have sort of like a left-wing Joe Rogan or someone who can like embody that kind of appealing masculinity in a similar way. And I know Clay's answer would be, oh, well, the Democrats or the left has a male problem, I think, as he put it. But I would like to hear from someone on the ideological left, or maybe more toward the center, why maybe the left wing hasn't been able to produce anyone nearly as popular, or I guess.
Well, I'm not on the ideological left at all, but I think Barack Obama was one of the most popular political figures, in quite some time, particularly with young men. And he played basketball. He was very athletic. For the millennial generation, he was like the cool politician. And I think in the same way that Gen Z men had gravitated to Trump, millennial men, gushed over Obama. So this was not that long ago, before your time. So I don't think it's that long. I think the problem the Democratic Party has now is they're not even on the same playing field. The Democratic Party's website has a list of 15 different demographic groups, or something like 15 or 16, that they quote unquote advocate for, right? So women, LGBTQ people, veterans, seniors, young people. Who's not on that list anywhere? Men. So I think they're just not showing up at all. And so they're kind of throwing Hail Marys last minute and picking the Tim Wallses, which are not the kind of figures that I think for at least a lot of younger men are attractive and relatable. And so I think the party has to get its head on straight there, I think, a little bit.
All right, last question. You in the blue shirt.
Yeah, hello. My name is Alex. I'm a second year at the college, and personally, when I'm looking at a political candidate, I want to see someone who is actually capable of doing their job instead of masculine. My question is then, why do we see the struggle of like the Democratic Party not being able to appeal to white men? What can they do differently? And then same thing for the Republican Party. How can they adapt their platform to appeal more to women?
My answer on the backside is I think that married women, actually you look at how they vote, there's a big difference between married women and single women. The Democrat Party, by and large, is the party of single women in terms of looking at the big gaps in votes. I thought that's a great answer about Barack Obama. I don't know who the Democrat figure is now that would appeal to men, which is what I was saying off the top. I mean, you can make arguments, Mayor Pete, you can say John Fetterman, you can say Josh Shapiro, you can say Gavin Newsom, J.B. Pritzker. I don't know that any of those connect in a way that's going to make a substantial difference.
Not even Mark Kelly? Mark Kelly?
I don't think Mark Kelly's that smart. Astronaut from Arizona.
I will say I think the GOP is going to have a problem post-Trump. There's not another Republican that I can name that can do what Trump can do in terms of appealing across the race and ethnic divide, across the generational divide. The party's going to have to. I mean, Trump, I'm sure, would love to run for a third term, but I think that it's going to be really interesting to see. He's already saying that J.D. Vance is not his.
I actually think there's a lot of Republican men that will do very well, and I think the part of your discussion that doesn't get talked about enough. Trump won the least racially divisive election since 1964. Most people don't know this. In 60 years, probably almost the voting life of everybody in this room, we've never had a less racially divisive election in terms of the votes than 2024 in the coalition Trump put together, which actually grew a ton, not only for white men, but Black, Hispanic, and Asian too.
Right.
Well, we are out of time. Magdalene, Clay, Dan, thank you guys so much, and thank you, audience, for coming and showing up.
Pleasure.